Hello everyone, welcome back to the Alterra Training Podcast, where our goal is to educate and empower you to take control of your health and fitness. Today we have the third installment of the debates with Logan Allen from Stronghold Health and Performance. If you guys have been tuned in to the last couple of episodes, I hope that you enjoyed them. This one I think will be just as good as the other ones. For now, this is our last one in the debate series. If you guys like it, definitely let us know and send in some questions. Logan, how you doing this morning?
Well, doing pretty well. How about you?
I'm good, man. I'm excited for this. These have been fun.
I really enjoyed the debate episodes for sure.
Yeah, so as I said, this is the last one that we have scheduled, mostly because we have a lot of other stuff that we want to get to that's been a long time coming. That being said, if you guys have seen the other episodes, you know the format for today. Same type of thing. Basically, we have a handful of questions. I'm going to basically ask Logan the question. He's either going to take the affirmative or the negative and defend his stance, and then I'll have my turn to take the opposite stance. What will probably happen, as happened in previous episodes, is we actually agree on a lot of this stuff. So hopefully it's going to be much more educational than an actual debate. Some of these questions, though, I genuinely don't know the answer to, and I don't know if Logan has an answer to them. So hopefully it makes for good debate and good information. So, without further ado, let's get started. All right, Logan, question number 1. Are elite athletes at their quote-unquote genetic potential? So give us like a brief, what your current kind of understanding of like genetic potential is, and then go from there.
So the genetic potential is essentially the term that defines like the peak of human capacity for a given individual. So someone with a really high genetic potential, maybe such as an Olympic athlete, they'll be able to do really well in a lot of athletic endeavors. But the term that we're trying to define like today, genetic potential, is how close are we to the peak? Because we continually see as exercise science develops that world records are continually being broken. Athletes are getting stronger, faster, lighter. And I think it's a really cool thing. The field of exercise science is really only about like a century old. It's a really young field when you compare it to like physics and math and astronomy and some of the...
Even medicine, which we kind of assume medicine is a newer field, but it's hundreds, and well, technically probably thousands of years old, depending on your definition.
So exercise science is a combination of a lot of those different fields, such as like really physics and medicine. It's kind of a combination of those. But it's, like I said, it's a very young field. It hasn't been around for a long time. So I'm in the boat, maybe I'm just needlessly optimistic that we're not close to our genetic potential. I think as we develop better nutrition protocols, as we develop better training protocols, as we develop and can discover better ways to recover, I think we're going to keep smashing through that genetic potential through our current genetic potential until we reach that top genetic potential. But even then, I don't think we're anywhere close to finding that yet. I think I'll let you go, and then if I have any rebuttals.
Yeah, so as with probably most of these prompts, I actually agree with Logan. I do not think that we are really... I don't want to say we're not anywhere close to our genetic potential. And this is, at least I view this as an individual topic, not like us as the human race as a species. Like individual athletes, of course the question is worded, are elite athletes at their genetic potential? I think that they are not at their genetic potential, but I'll give some some thoughts that could maybe convince you that they are already at their genetic potential. The biggest thought that I had would basically be, if you look at the training that these individuals go through, it's so specific and so high volume, and they get such little return from their gains. So most of you listening to this, you could go out for, 3 to 5 mile jog. And if you did that a few days a week for a few weeks, you would probably see some fitness performance, whether it's VO2 or just the way that you feel on that run, lactate threshold, body composition, resting heart rate at different intensities, whatever it may be. But these elite athletes, specifically I'm thinking of the either ends to, the power lifters, strongmen, or the endurance athletes. They do so much training. A lot of them, the endurance athletes, do well over 100 miles of training every single week. They have their dietitians, they have their recovery and their sleep experts. They live and breathe whatever their specific practice is. And still, world records are struggling to be... They are being broken, but what's happening is it's, depending on the event, it's by fractions of a percent every single time. So we had, a few years ago, we had Eliud Kipchoge break that 2-hour marathon mark. But even that, technically, is up for debate. I count it personally. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this. Basically, there were some things that people thought made it unofficial, which I do not disagree with, but I still think it's human innovation that got him there. Regardless, he's, at least statistically and through the records we have now, he is the best marathon runner that we've ever seen. And he's still kind of on that 2-hour marathon edge. And I would speculate within the next 10, 20 years, we're going to have people that are at the, hour 55, hour 56 mark, which is only a handful of minutes. But as Logan was saying, our field is so young and we have so much to learn and so much to implement with basically any type of athlete, but endurance athletes in particular. Some of the stuff we'll talk about today, athletes are not really, at least in our opinions, probably not optimizing every aspect of their fitness, even if they are training very specifically for their sport. So, the biggest thing that I come back to with genetic potential is I assume they're pretty capped out, at least specific to their event. That's, of course, a major caveat here. It has to be specific to whatever you're measuring it. So, the same marathon runner, Eliud Kipchoge, obviously nowhere near his quote-unquote genetic potential for his strength. Same concept. We have the strongmen and powerlifters. They're all fighting over who can deadlift the most, and this is right around 500 kilograms. We've had Eddie Hall pull 500 kilograms, and then Hafthor Bjornsson, did he pull 501 or 505? Do you remember?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
It was something that was barely over 500 kilograms. But same kind of thing as the official world record with marathon running. There's a lot of people who actually don't count his as official because it didn't follow certain parameters. It happened during COVID time, so it wasn't able to be an actual meet. So all this to say, world records, they're being broken, but is it because of genetic potential or is it because of technology or some other factors outside of genetic potential? So when I think of genetic potential, we're talking about, are your genes expressing themselves in the optimal way for your sport? So in the context of the marathon event, Eliud Kipchoge wore special shoes that helped preserve a lot of the energy. And that had obviously nothing to do with the way that his genes were expressing themselves. Similar concepts, even if we're looking at biomechanics, different biomechanics and technique of exercises. If you look at the bench press, you'll see individuals who are having drastically different grip widths, different techniques, different arches in their back. Are they actually getting stronger, and are their genes expressing different basically proteins that actually allow them to be stronger, or are we finding other ways to get stronger? So again, personal opinion, we are not at the genetic potential, but we're probably seeing more gains from aspects outside of genetics than that are directly caused by genetics. But again, as Logan said, we're a young field. There's going to be a whole lot of different training modalities that come along over the next 5, 10, 15 years. All right, you got anything else, Logan?
I actually hadn't thought about the point of the mechanical advantage that comes from different shoes, or even a bench press, the bench shirt they wear, or the squat suit. So there is a blooming field around that as well, of how can we engineer something that allows us to break a record. So I think we'll see a lot of gains from that as well, probably in the near future, just because, like I said, it's a growing industry. And I didn't even think about that, so that was a really good point that you brought up. I do want to make a note around the psychology of it, because it took us for a long time. We thought a sub 4 minute mile was impossible, and then one person did it, and all of a sudden everyone started. Not everyone, but
hundreds of people.
Couple years.
So
it was deemed impossible for I don't know exactly how long, but it was deemed impossible for a long time. And then all it took was that one person to finally achieve that achievement, and then everyone started doing it. So there's a large, I think, mindset component where we think something's impossible and we kind of bring that into existence. Whereas maybe if we think something is possible because someone else has done it, there's a greater chance that we can convince ourselves that we can do that too. And I think we'll probably see that soon as well with the marathon. Now that the 2-hour marathon's been broken, I think we'll start to see that relatively commonly, just as more people become confident that they can break a 2-hour marathon. It's not some impossible feat because it has been done before.
Yeah, totally agree. All right, on to the next. Is resistance, i.e. strength, power, hypertrophy, whatever it may be, is resistance or endurance training better for health and longevity?
So for health and longevity, I'm going to have to go with resistance training. I think as we age, our muscles kind of have a bias towards atrophying type 2 muscle fibers. What that means is that as we age, we have 2 different types of muscle fibers. Type 1 muscle fibers, which are these slow twitch, they're more efficient. That's what we would use to primarily run like a marathon, ultra marathon, versus fast twitch, which is what we would use to maybe do like a clean, do an Olympic lift, any sort of powerlifting, because they're stronger, they're faster, but they also fatigue a little bit easier, which is why we wouldn't use them to run a marathon. So as we age, we kind of gradually lose our type 2 muscle fibers, and they gradually become type 1 muscle fibers, which is one reason that in the older population, when they fall, they have a hard time catching themselves because they have less type 2 muscle fibers, so they don't have the ability to move quite as quickly to be able to react and catch themselves. There's multiple reasons why falling is common in the older population, but that is one of them. So I think for health and longevity, we want to train our type 2 muscle fibers so that they don't atrophy, we don't lose them. Because there's a principle in physiology, it's use it or lose it. So we either use those muscle fibers, we either move fast, pull something really heavy, push something really heavy, move a heavy object, or we will lose our type 2 muscle fibers. We don't necessarily see that as much with type 1 muscle fibers. Type 1 muscle fibers are pretty much with you forever. We really want to prevent, though, that shift from type 2 to type 1. And the primary way to do that is resistance training, because that is where we will lift something heavy, which will activate the type 2 muscle fibers. That's where if we're doing Olympic lifts, that's where we'll move something really fast, which will also be heavy, which will activate the type 2 muscle fibers. And through resistance training, that preservation of the type 2 muscle fibers is what we really want. So that's why I'm going to say resistance training is more important for health and longevity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what Logan is ultimately getting at is super common diseases with aging would be sarcopenia and osteoporosis. Resistance training certainly helps ward those off. Even if we're not talking about the diseased state of sarcopenia or osteoporosis, what Logan is talking about is still very much a real thing. And just because you're not at the level of decrepit or in the disease state does not mean that the loss of type 2 fibers is an issue. So I'll say that endurance training is better for health and longevity. I kind of believe that this is actually true. However, fortunately, in the real world, we don't really have to choose between this or that. There are distinct benefits to both of them. But we can also go kind of to the muscular level as well when we're looking at vascularization, substrate utilization, in this case, basically being able to use more energy, whether it's fat or carbohydrates, being able to use more energy more efficiently. And then along those same lines is mitochondrial density. So mitochondrial density, basically how many mitochondria are in a certain given space within the muscle. This is a really, really good reflection of cardiovascular and metabolic health, but also of cardiovascular and metabolic fitness as well. So you guys probably all know mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. When we're talking about the mitochondria of the muscle cell at large, we're talking about a massive amount of oxidative power, oxidative energy producing power basically being available. So if you can have this capacity to produce a great deal of energy aerobically, then this is going to, of course, increase your functional capacity, which is going to allow you to do activities of daily living, do basically anything that you want to do. Of course, in this context, maybe not lift super heavy, maybe not lift super fast, but it will still at least allow you to do the activities of daily living. Yes, resistance training certainly has some benefits for the heart and vascular system. However, endurance exercise does have more benefits to specifically the heart and the vascular system. It's going to help you increase the total amount of capillaries, which are little blood vessels, strengthen the heart. It's going to strengthen the heart in the same ways as endurance training, but also more ways. We don't need to get into that, but basically whatever ventricles and other aspects of the heart are being strengthened by resistance training are also being strengthened by endurance training. Also, endurance training is probably a little bit better at utilizing blood sugar, so it's going to help reduce your chances of developing type 2 diabetes. And if you have type 2 diabetes, going to help a little bit more. Again, resistance training is still useful for that, but endurance training is a little bit better. Same thing with your blood triglycerides and your LDL cholesterol. Endurance training is going to help bring those down to a greater extent, probably going to help reduce hypertension more as well. But as we look at all these variables, both resistance training and endurance training help all of them. It's just to a greater extent. So really, if we're just dialing it down, boiling it down to the basics, if we can even just get most people in this population that we're talking about, trying to help keep people healthy and live a high quality life, if we can even just get them to those ACSM guidelines of just 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity a week, and then 2 good solid resistance training sessions a week. These guidelines seem very low to like Logan and I and a lot of our friends, and hopefully for you that sounds low as well. But even just getting most Americans to this level of activity should help a lot with the public health and longevity. All right, you got anything else?
Yeah, in terms of longevity, there are several different variables that we see highly correlated with longevity. One of those is a high VO2 max. Another one of those is the amount of lean body mass you have. So we see time and time again that we want to have good endurance, but we also want to be strong and have a good amount of muscle in order to have a good amount of longevity. I do want to caveat that though and say that correlation doesn't equal causation. Chances are there's a little bit of healthy user bias in terms of the fact that people that have a good endurance and have a lot of muscle mass tend to do other healthy activities as well. They probably eat well, they probably get a good amount of sleep, they probably don't do some of the things that someone that doesn't have good endurance or doesn't have a high amount of muscle mass would do. But
smoking, alcohol,
yes,
stuff like that.
Yeah. Needless to say, we want to have a good VO2 max, so endurance, and a good amount of lean body mass, so a lot of muscle. And I think, yeah, that's really all I got actually.
Yeah. All right. One quick question on this. We should move on for time, but I'll go ahead and ask. Do you think that if we're measuring this stuff in a lab and we're correlating it to health and longevity, do you think that muscle mass or muscle strength is more important for health and longevity? I personally don't think that we can really separate the two and actually give an answer, but I'll definitely let you give your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think, in my opinion, and this is completely my opinion, I think muscle strength is probably higher or more correlated to longevity than muscle mass. But at the end of the day, we don't want to do a 1 rep max with grandma. That's just not something we probably want to do. So it's easier to maybe do an in-body or a DEXA scan or a different estimate of their lean body mass, because it's going to be a much less invasive, much lower risk than doing some form of a strength assessment. That being said, we are developing a lot of protocols around like the isometric mid-thigh pull and different strength tests that don't require movement that could potentially be used for a study in the elderly population to test their max strength, and we could see if there's a higher correlation with strength than muscle mass, but to my knowledge, no one's done that yet. Once again, this is a young field. There's still plenty of questions we need to ask. But for right now, I think that strength is probably more related, but at the end of the day, mass is easier to test.
For sure. I am aware of a study that looks at grip strength versus muscle mass, and it showed that grip strength was better correlated than muscle mass with health and longevity. We're not going to go into it for time's sake, but using grip strength as a measure of overall whole body strength, probably not the best way to do it. But as Logan said, there are certainly safety concerns that go along with studying this. So we'll save that for another time and we'll move on. All right, should ultra endurance or even just like true endurance athletes do resistance training?
Okay. One of these times I feel like we need to flip who's asking so that way you have the ability to answer as you truly wish to answer.
That's okay. I'm flexible.
I'm going to say yes, ultra endurance athletes should do resistance training. I think that they should do resistance training differently than a bodybuilder perhaps, because they don't need to be big for their events. But I do think having a good amount of strength would help them in their running events or whatever ultra endurance they're doing, whether that's biking, rowing, swimming, whatever. So I think the biggest thing with ultra endurance athletes is we want to make sure the stimulus to fatigue ratio is there. We want to get a good amount of stimulus, but we're not trying to fatigue them a lot because, well, obviously they have to train for their ultra endurance race. So if someone's running, if they're running 100 miles a week, they already have to recover a lot. They don't need so much more fatigue that they're just completely burnt out and maybe reaching into that overtraining syndrome like we talked about in, I believe, the first episode. So, in general, I think resistance training should be done, but we really want to make sure we're not just needlessly fatiguing the athletes. So that being said, I would keep the volume pretty low and just do a lot of high intensity, low volume work. So primarily strength training, not trying to do any hypertrophy, not trying to build any muscle, just trying to make sure that our strength is there, that we're still maintaining those type 2 muscle fibers, and making sure we have plenty of rest in between sets. But I do think that appropriate programming for resistance training can prevent a lot of the overuse injuries we commonly see in ultra endurance events. So taking ultra marathons, for example, runners oftentimes, because they're constantly going in that sagittal plane, they're constantly going forward. They're never really using the lateral or the muscles that move us laterally. So incorporating maybe some lateral lunges and some exercises that help train our adductors or glute medius, the muscles that move us side to side, can help prevent a lot of the overuse injuries that we see, because if those muscles get weak, we have a much harder time stabilizing our knees, maybe our ankles, and that's when we are more prone to injuries. So I think, especially in terms of an injury prevention standpoint, ultra endurance athletes should do resistance training.
All right, so I gotta say that ultra endurance athletes should not do resistance training. And Logan addressed my biggest issue here, which is the amount of recovery that it takes to actually recover and adapt to resistance training. So especially if resistance training is a novel stimulus and these athletes are not really used to it, then even just a few tough sets of squats can leave them sore and fatigued for their next handful of runs, really. So he already addressed that context. As long as you have good balance in that and maintenance and good programming, then you should be able to do resistance training. So that I can try to stick to the prompt, I'm going to twist it a little bit. I can still stick with the fact that they should not do resistance training because it's too far away, it's too non-specific to their event, and of course the recovery aspect. So in place of that, and studies show that this is likely just as beneficial for performance, if not more beneficial for performance, but probably not as good on the injury prevention side of things, would be I would replace a resistance training program with a plyometrics program. So plyometrics, this could be a large different selection of exercises. Generally, this is just some kind of hop, jump. This could even be sprinting. Just something that activates the type 2 muscle fibers and the stress shortening cycle to a greater degree than actual running. So we're still getting a lot of the muscular, neuromuscular, and some of the physiological benefits of resistance training with a much lower recovery cost. So if we can, in an ideal world, what Logan said about if you're going to do resistance training, keep the reps low, even though that means it's heavy. This is actually going to help us target what we actually want to adapt and not just kind of throw extra volume at them. So that tactic, really beneficial. But if we want to go a step further and they actually want to avoid resistance training altogether, maybe they have back issues or they have some sort of fear of resistance training, any number of things, then a lot of the benefits from resistance training can be acquired through plyometrics training. Again, not a perfect exchange. Ideally, really any program that I can think of at least should have endurance training, resistance training, and some form of plyometric and or power training. There is a distinction there. We don't need to get into it today, but there is a very clear distinction between power and plyometric training. So for today, Logan wins. He says that ultra endurance athletes should do resistance training. I also think they should. However, I do think that there's a little bit of a workaround in this context. You have any more thoughts?
I just wanted to briefly address the interference effect. The interference effect is much, much smaller than we originally thought, maybe a decade or so ago. And for a while, a lot of runners were afraid of lifting because they didn't want to hinder their running performance. And a lot of lifters were scared of doing any cardio because they were afraid of missing out on their strength or their hypertrophy. We now know that that's really not or shouldn't be a concern. We should feel free to run, lift, or do cardio, lift, whatever we really want without fear of one influencing the other, and at least in a negative way. That being said, if that is something you're concerned about, we still recommend you do both, but maybe split it up into 2 separate sessions. So maybe if you run one day, lift another day, or if you're a little bit more ambitious with it, you can go for a run in the morning and lift later in the day. And that way you have plenty of time in between. But it shouldn't be something you're worried about.
Yeah, so that's actually, we have that question, 2 questions. Basically, is the interference effect something to worry about?
Whoops, I got ahead of myself.
You're good.
I forgot about that question.
So I'll define a little bit what the interference effect is. And then Logan obviously just spoke on it, but I'll give him a turn to elaborate further. So the interference effect basically is whatever exercise modality you choose to implement is going to have certain effects. So specific adaptations to impose demands, the SAID principle. Similar to the concept of specificity. Basically, whatever you do, whatever demand you place on your body is what the body is going to adapt to. So if you do a strength training exercise, training session, you're going to ideally get stronger, probably grow a little bit of muscle. Definitely going to have a lot of neuromuscular benefits to that. But if you do a endurance training program, you're going to train mostly the opposite fiber type. So resistance training, generally type 2, endurance training, generally type 1. But oftentimes, since endurance training is so energetically demanding, it theoretically takes away from the recovery adaptive energy, which is basically a theoretical concept. We don't know what adaptive energy is. It's more of a concept. time, rest, again, recovery. The thought is basically, yes, one takes away from the other in terms of recoverability, but also that one takes away from the other directly. So resistance training, very anabolic, really designed to build up and develop new tissue, whereas endurance training, very catabolic, not necessarily breaking down tissue, but breaking down molecules to extract energy. Also, studies do show that excessive endurance training with a lack of resistance training is going to reduce your type 2 muscle fibers as well. So theoretically, we have these two types of exercises pulling opposite directions. And there is some basis for this. If we look at AMP kinase, which is basically a sensor for how much energy, or really how little energy, is in the muscle cells, we know that somewhere along the mTOR pathway, we don't know exactly where, but somewhere along it, it basically inhibits mTOR. And that's important because mTOR is responsible for muscle growth and muscle hypertrophy. So there is some cellular molecular grounds for this. However, long-term studies show that as long as you're not really specializing in one specific thing, like examples from earlier, Eliud Kipchoge should probably not be doing a powerlifting workout 5 days a week. And Hafthor Bjornsson and Eddie Hall probably should not be running 80 to 120 miles a week, or else it will start to take away. You have any more thoughts on that?
I think, once again, this boils down to the question of performance versus longevity. And I would argue, even for most people, performance, they benefit from doing both. But if you're truly elite, you do want to really specialize, like Trace was just saying, in your specific event. Because like you said, the set principle specific adaptations to imposed demands, we're going to get the most bang for our buck doing our specific event. So if I'm training to be a powerlifter, I probably shouldn't be running 100 miles a week. If I'm training to be an average powerlifter, it'd probably be fine. Once again, it boils down to health versus performance, or longevity versus performance. I had a second thing to say, and I lost it.
Was it something along the lines of similar to our previous question, some resistance training can help endurance, and some endurance training can help resistance training?
Oh, it's exactly what it was. You read my mind. Some literature out there even indicates that doing some resistance training flip that around. Some literature out there, it does indicate that doing some cardiovascular training does actually help us recover from our resistance training. So because aerobic training, like Trace was alluding to earlier, helps our heart, helps increase the capillaries, so it helps blood flow around our body so that we can appropriately transport oxygen more efficiently. That's one of the main benefits of cardio. If we can transport oxygen, we can transport molecules really efficiently, theoretically that also means that we can transport them more efficiently for resistance training and thus recover faster from our resistance training. So a lot of times there's a net benefit when you do both together, contrary to, I guess, popular belief.
Yeah, so there's a whole Alterra episode on the interference effect if you guys want to go back and listen to that. It's only like 20 minutes or so. It basically says a lot of what we say, but gives some more tips and tricks and puts it into context a little bit more. So to summarize, the interference effect is a real thing. It's not some made-up thing. There is theory behind it. Basically, cellular signaling pathways do interfere with each other, and total recovery volume is something to account for. However, for most people, it's going to be a very negligible effect, and the benefits are likely going to outweigh the negative aspects of it. So I think this is actually appropriate that we went here, and then we're going to the next question. So the question says, are CrossFit Games athletes, so the highest level of CrossFit athletes, or the best quote-unquote hybrid athletes, fitter? So CrossFit Games athletes, of course, the most competitive CrossFit athletes in the world. And then hybrid athletes, this is kind of a new thing, new term. Basically the same thing as athletes who do concurrent training for both long duration endurance, and this is how we're going to define it, because some of them look at even just like a mile time and strength. In this context, we're going to look at long duration endurance. We'll call it a half marathon or longer, and some sort of either high threshold strength or power. So generally, that would be like Olympic weightlifting or powerlifting. So me personally, I'm very much in the mediocre ultra marathon realm, and then kind of the powerlifting aspect. But I have a friend who is like in the half marathon to marathon range, but he's like a kind of a much more of an Olympic weightlifter. So Logan, tell us where you fall kind of in the hybrid, and then go ahead and address CrossFit Games athletes versus hybrid athletes.
Can you repeat the first part of that question?
Yeah. Are CrossFit Games athletes or the best hybrid athletes fitter?
So I think it's important to determine how we define like fit. Because depending on your definition of fit, we could really answer this one way or the other. In my opinion, CrossFit Games athletes are extraordinarily fit, but because of the way they often train, they're kind of mediocre at everything. You're not going to go up to a CrossFitter and expect them to deadlift more than a powerlifter. You're not going to expect them to run faster than a track athlete. You're not going to expect them to clean more than an Olympic lifter. So they're great at everything, but not, or they're good at everything, but not like great at any one specific thing. Typically. Of course, there are exceptions, and the CrossFit Games athletes, I think the CrossFit Games athletes are a bit of an exception to this because they're at the very top of their field. To my understanding, though, a lot of the athletes that make it to the CrossFit Games train almost like a hybrid athlete, which leads me to my answer to this question. But they do their CrossFit workouts, then they do their powerlifting workouts, they do their running workouts, and they end up training like a hybrid athlete with the intention of training for CrossFit. I don't think anyone that goes to the CrossFit Games is exclusively doing CrossFit workouts. They're going to have some Olympic lifting workouts programmed in there. They're going to have some powerlifting workouts programmed. They're going to have some just strict running workouts. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day that is a relatively high-level CrossFit athlete, definitely not going to the CrossFit Games, but she's relatively good at what she does. And she coaches CrossFit, and she does like a CrossFit workout every day, but she also has a separate program that she's following to get stronger. She's running a powerlifting program kind of on the side, which is kind of the definition of a hybrid athlete. They're doing two different sports, whether that's, in this scenario, CrossFit and powerlifting, whether that's CrossFit and running. I think the elite CrossFit athletes essentially are hybrid athletes. That being said, hybrid athlete is a more broad term. I think hybrid athletes tend to be the fitter bunch because they are really good at multiple events. I think the benefit of the hybrid athlete is that because we're splitting our training sessions into different goals, we can get a better stimulus from each one. Some of the problems with CrossFit is that maybe we'll run and then we'll immediately lift, and then maybe we'll go from like a run immediately to a deadlift, immediately to like box jumps, and we realistically can't perform super well on a deadlift if we just got back from a run. And if we just ran into deadlifts, our box jumps are going to be really brutal. We're not going to put maximal effort into each jump. Whereas if we took a hybrid approach, we did maybe a plyometric session, a running session, maybe a powerlifting session where we did our deadlifts, there would be a lot more intent on the specific adaptation we're trying to get rather than just kind of hodgepodging it all together. So that's my answers.
So you say hybrid athletes are fitter?
Yes.
Yeah, I really actually think that you made a really good point when you said So basically, kind of my final thoughts on what you were saying, and I think it actually makes a lot of sense, is hybrid athletes are kind of, and I hate to use this word because it's demeaning to the other side, but almost the more intellectual approach to CrossFit. So as Logan said, a lot of times, at least the good athletes are going to run separate programs and then kind of mesh it together, get more specific as competition comes. So, yeah, I actually, even though I am a hybrid athlete, call myself that, whatever that even means, again, we gave a definition to that. I'm actually pretty comfortable saying that CrossFit Games athletes are fitter than hybrid athletes. So I'm in my mind trying to think of the fittest hybrid athletes that I'm aware of. I can think of a handful. Nick Bear comes to mind. Ross Edgley, who is big in the swimming, basically ultra distance swimming world. There's a ton of really fit hybrid athletes out there. But when I think about putting them up against your Matt Frasers or your Rich Fronings, obviously they would do slightly better at like the max strength or the really, really long duration events. However, there's so much arbitrary fitness that can occur between those two endpoints. So you have, of course, on one end, extreme endurance, on the other end, extreme strength, where the hybrid athlete is going to reign, and then a little bit funneling in from that, they're going to still do pretty well because it's close enough to their specific sports. But you have the CrossFit athlete who is so good at the, for lack of better terms, we'll just call it like high threshold, anaerobic, slightly aerobic type work. If you guys are familiar with CrossFit, you'll kind of know what I'm getting at here. Those workouts that last from 5 to 15 minutes, absolute burners. A lot of them do require some strength, some power, but a lot of it is muscular endurance and concentrated work capacity. So they have such a high peak in that realm, so in the center basically of strength and endurance, that as you start to branch out from there, then they're still going to be pretty dominant for a while. So at least in the graph in my mind, maybe we'll put up some chart or something to help describe this. But basically at either end, the hybrid athlete, the high-level hybrid athlete is going to be better, one in endurance, one in strength. And then toward the middle, of course, the CrossFit athlete is going to be better. But if you're looking at total space across this theoretical graph that I've just made up in my mind, the total space of fitness covered is about the same, whereas the CrossFit athlete is not as specialized, obviously, but highly, highly effective at, honestly, the much more uncomfortable stuff. Whereas the hybrid athlete, of course, is much better at the peak strength, peak power probably as well, and then endurance. So I'm actually fine saying that CrossFit Games athletes are fitter than the best hybrid athletes. But of course, if we were to really test it in a lab, we would have to do stuff like max strength, do like a Wingate anaerobic power test, and a VO2 max test, in which, honestly, I don't know. We would actually have to run that test to get the data. You have any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it all boils down to the way we define fitness. Because, once again, it's kind of like an arbitrary term, fitness. We, as a population, know what fitness means, but even within the population, you say, describe someone that's fit, and maybe someone will describe like a bodybuilder, and then you ask another person, describe someone that's fit, and maybe they'll describe like an elite marathoner, and there's a whole bunch of that subjective interpretation of fitness. But I would agree with what you said. CrossFit athletes, or CrossFit Games athletes specifically, are probably better at everything, whereas the hybrid athletes may be a little bit worse in some areas, but then higher, better than the CrossFit Games athletes in the areas in which they specialize in. So I would agree with you for the most part.
All right. So in your opinion, does the title Fittest on Earth that is given to the winner of the CrossFit Games every year, is that meaningful to you, and do you actually believe that the winner of the CrossFit Games is the quote-unquote fittest on Earth?
Honestly, it's not really meaningful to me. I don't... No, I probably wouldn't... They're definitely up there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I wouldn't say they're not fit at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like, obviously, they work really hard. They're obviously a great athlete. But they're the fittest CrossFit athlete in the world. I'd be really comfortable saying that. The fittest on earth... Yeah, I don't know. Because it boils down, like, somebody could look at C-Bum and say, C-Bum, who's just won his, like, 6th Mr. Olympia, he's probably the fittest on earth to some people. You look at Ross Edgley, who's really muscular, can also swim around Great Britain, which is crazy. That's a really long swim. They're like, okay, if he can do that while weighing probably at least 100 kilos, like, maybe that's the fittest on earth. There's a lot of variability there. I just don't like... I kind of see this in the same way, like the world's greatest stretch. I just really don't like that name. So whenever I do that stretch with my clients, I just call it the Spider-Man stretch. I've heard it called the Spider-Man complex before. I just don't really like ascribing world's greatest to anything because, I don't know, it's so subjective. Like what definition are we determining this by? And maybe if we had like a very strict definition of fitness, I would be more confident saying that they're the fittest on earth, but I don't feel confident enough saying that they're the fittest on earth to really give meaning to that title.
Yeah, I agree with you. Obviously, definitions are super important. However, outside of maybe like the people that you mentioned, some hybrid athletes, I just don't know who else we could possibly give that title to. Because if we give it to Eliud Kipchoge, fittest marathoner, fittest aerobically, fittest VO2 max, probably not absolute, but like he's the fittest that on earth. But if we're just using the term fittest, I'm actually fine with it. I don't like the fact that I'm fine with it, but I don't have any good counter argument. All right, last one. Do deadlifts, so we're talking about conventional, just straight bar deadlifts, belong, I'll change the question a little bit, deserve a prominent place in a strength and conditioning program? So the question says, do deadlifts belong in a strength and conditioning program? That's kind of a useless question. So I'll change it to, do deadlifts deserve a prominent place, meaning they get trained weekly or bi-weekly or more frequently in a strength and conditioning program? One caveat, strength and conditioning for some type of athlete that is not a powerlifter or a strongman.
So I feel like my answer might surprise you a little bit. I want to say no. I don't know what you...
I was going to say no too, but that's okay.
So, as we were talking about earlier, we want to examine the stimulus to fatigue ratio. The stimulus fatigue ratio is really high with deadlifts. You get a ton of stimulus. Like, they're a great exercise. But anyone that's done deadlifts will probably tell you they're also extremely fatiguing exercise. Arguably the most fatiguing exercise, period. So that being said, when we're training athletes, we want to make sure we keep an eye on that stimulus fatigue ratio because we want to get as much stimulus as we can with as little fatigue as possible so that the athletes can still perform well, they can still practice well, because at the end of the day, that sport, whatever it is their main focus, and we're not trying to train to be a power lifter. The amount of fatigue generated from a deadlift probably isn't super necessary. With certain exceptions, certain sports maybe. We can still train the posterior chain, which is essentially the whole complex that makes up your backside. So hamstrings, glutes, spinal erectors, basically your whole backside, like I just said. We can still train those muscles without necessarily performing a deadlift and generating that much fatigue. So there's machines out there, like Sorinex makes a machine called the Back Attack. I think that's a great machine. It's a great way to train the posterior chain without generating a ton of fatigue. There's exercises like kettlebell swings. We can do like hip thrusts or another good example that all generate relatively low amounts of fatigue, but still train that same musculature that we're trying to train when we do a deadlift. Yeah, I'll hand it off to you.
All right. So deadlifts are I have to say they are. Deadlifts are a great exercise. They incorporate most muscles of the body, as Logan said, posterior chain, yes. They also use all the muscles of the core, at least they're activated, not necessarily trained. That's a conversation for another time. Just because a muscle is activated doesn't mean you're actually training it. Definitely a lot of quad involvement as well. Even like your pecs, delts, everything is activated to keep your body stiff so that there's no folding under the tension. So I think it's a great tool to train core stability, and then kind of kinetic linking where you're actually keeping your body tight and stiff through the range of motion. Pretty much your whole torso should not really move at all. It should be mostly your knees and hips that are doing the movement. So as a training tool to address core stiffness and your ability to, of course, exert a high amount of force, it's a great exercise. There are variations, basically variations of the deadlift though, that will allow you to move more weight. However, the exact things that Logan says make it not worthy of a spot in strength and conditioning program, I think do make it worthy. So yes, there's a high fatigue index with deadlifts, but also a crazy stimulus index. You get a ton out of it. So a lot of times we're pressed for time. We might have 45 minutes to an hour a couple days a week. So if we're going to get as much bang for our buck as we can, then I'm going to throw in deadlifts as a main movement there, because although you accumulate a lot of fatigue from it, you're also moving a ton of weight. So just most collegiate athletes are easily going to be able to, I say easily, it's of course relative, they're going to be able to handle, 275 to 315 pounds somewhat, pretty safely, somewhat handily, and get a really big stimulus out of that. Again, yes, you're accumulating a lot of fatigue, but you're also getting a lot done in a short amount of time. So again, core stiffness, your stance when your feet are closer together, that can definitely be seen in some sporting contexts. So if we're comparing deadlift versus squat, a lot of times people focus so much on their squat depth or squat strength that they're going to manipulate their feet and knee and hip angles so drastically that it no longer looks like what you're doing in the sport. Maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing. However, training just in that vertical plane, of course you're going to have some sagittal movement of knees and hips, but training basically putting force into the ground as much as you can is going to have some benefit for strength athletes, of course, but also even runners where we're just trying to, again, build that kinetic chain. And not to mention stuff like bone density and neuromuscular facilitation, motor recruitment. There's going to be a whole bunch of physiological responses that require an ultra high threshold for them to be activated. As Logan said, use or lose it. Deadlift is a great way to use a lot of the stuff that we will otherwise lose. That being said, my real thoughts are more aligned with Logan. I think that the deadlift actually is a great exercise. I do it. I'm actually going to do it today once we're done recording the podcast. However, in the strength and conditioning world, I do think that it has too high of maybe not a risk. I don't want to make it sound like deadlifts are inherently dangerous. However, individuals do get hurt quite a bit on deadlifts. But more that fatigue to benefit to fatigue ratio. It's really, not that it's terrible, like there are worse things for sure, but as Logan kind of alluded to, you can get a similar stimulus in other ways. So personally, when I'm programming for a lot of my tactical athletes, a lot of times I'll just have them do both like a barbell back squat and a kettlebell swing. And in my opinion, it's really addressing all of the same things that a deadlift might address, but in probably a safer way, a more dynamic way, greater range of motion, and a little bit more, hate to use the word functional, but probably a little bit more functional, at least a little bit more going on in a good way than just a deadlift where you're really just putting force into the ground. Do you have any more thoughts?
Yeah, I think, like Trace kind of said a little bit, context matters the most. Deadlifts can still be a great option depending on the sport you're working with, the amount of time in which you have in the weight room. They can also be a really bad option depending on those same variables. So it really just depends on your specific situation, how much time you have, how much fatigue you're already working with, how much time the athlete will have to recover, and just making a educated decision of, should I program something with this much fatigue? Is this a smart option?
Yeah. All right, guys. That's it for today. Thank you for listening to the third debate with Logan. Again, Logan from Stronghold Health and Performance. So for now, this is the final debate. Please let us know if you liked it. If you did like it, give us some questions. We'll, of course, address them. This is not our last collaboration together. This is just the last scheduled debate that we have. So stay tuned. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you're listening on Spotify, go ahead and give us a follow. Give us 5 stars if you liked it. And then Logan posts these on YouTube as well under Stronghold Health and Performance. Got any closing thoughts? Yep, go ahead.
Same thing. If you want to watch it on YouTube, like and subscribe. We'd greatly appreciate it. You can always leave us a comment really easily on YouTube as well. If you do have questions for future debates, or if you have a question for more of a long form podcast where we just discuss a singular topic, which is what we're kind of planning on starting to do in the near future. Feedback is greatly appreciated.
Yes, sir. All right, thanks, guys. Have a good one.